Hello, welcome everyone to the MuseScore Café for today, July 1st, 2020, and this is the 100th episode. I did the math on that yesterday, and I'm really happy that I did because I knew it was coming up, and here it is. So, my name is Marc Sabatella, and I'm the Director of Education for MuseScore, and this is my the 100th in my regular series of these informal chats that I do. And I know many of you watching have seen many of these before, and I want to just do a little retrospective a little bit, and take questions about anything as always. And I'd like to say hello to everyone who's here watching live, and I know many more people end up watching later on. So good morning, good evening. My goal today is really just to talk about, some of the things that this MuseScore Cafe has been, what it's been about, what kinds of things we've done, what kinds of things it could be, and talk about the larger story around it. So yeah, thank you. When I started this, I really didn't know for sure what was going to come of it. It was an idea I had. And it turns out, I think, to have been a very good idea. I'm glad people are enjoying it. But let me tell you a little bit about how it came about. Some important background to understand is that when I first got involved with MuseScore, it was 10 years ago, and I was volunteering my time just as a developer to help fix some bugs, implement some things. Actually, it started off just about documentation, so it really was about helping with the educational experience and the providing support on the forums and just all the things that I've been doing for many years. That's how it started, and eventually I got in the development, and over time my involvement got greater and greater. So at some point, when MuseScore 2 came out, I was approached and said, "Well, why don't you write the book?" And we'll call it Mastering MuseScore, and write a book like a really comprehensive reference guide on using MuseScore. So I did that, and then that was sort of my first venture into anything I don't know, bigger than just whatever else I was doing, because it was a big project. And then, over time, I started doing more things, developing, and I started working on the idea of maybe developing an online course. And right around that time is when this big changeover, many of you may know, the original developers of MuseScore, Werner, Nicola, and Thomas, came to a point where it became harder and harder to sustain the business, especially with regard to MuseScore.com, and the business aspect of it ended up getting sold to Ultimate Guitar, who kind of took it over, but the application remains open source, and I continued my involvement with it. But at the time, I was like, well, I really want to make this my career somehow, what I'm doing with MuseScore. That's what I was developing this online course, figuring that would be part of it, and then wanted there just to be lots of different aspects to what I would do. So that's kind of where this came from. So one of the things that I want to do today is just sort of take a look at some of what I think of as the highlights of where this cafe has been, some of the subjects that we've talked about, and maybe post some links so that those of you who haven't seen them can see some of these things. And these are just handpicked by me highlights. But interspersed with that, I originally had this idea, if this hadn't turned out to be episode 100, that I was going to talk about some aspect of music creation, music theory, because this is where my head is at right now. One of the things I'm going to talk about is where I'm going right now, what I'm doing, and one of the things I'm working on is I've already put out this basic theory course that just covers the real essentials. Here are your major scales, here's key signatures, intervals, here's what major and minor chords are, etc. Not really anything about the compositional process or anything, but just nomenclature things, basic theory. So now I'm working on a course specifically on harmony, talking about chord progressions and analyzing chord progressions, creating chord progressions, etc. And so this is where my head has been the last month or two. And a couple months, really. So one of the things I want to do is talk about a little bit of what I'm working on there. And it just so happens that a lot of what you do ends up in this context. You usually present it in the context of these four-part SATB chorale style pieces. So I'm going to start off musically here just by playing you the hymn known as Old Hundredth, and it's called that because Psalm 100 from the Bible is one of the many different sets of lyrics that this has been set to. But I'm just going to play the music, and hopefully it will be audible because I didn't actually hear that when I clicked on it, did I? So there you have it. That's Old Hundredth. I learned this growing up as Praise God from whom all blessings flow. It was a Thanksgiving song, but there's other psalms, other lyrics that have been set to it before and since. One of the things I should mention about it is this is one of the places you get to see a little bit about the history and the culture of different churches, because I grew up in going to church at a Catholic church, and we would have a joint Thanksgiving service with a Lutheran church, and that's where we learned things like, oh, we have different ways of saying the Lord's Prayer, because the Catholic church has this little interjection from the priest in the middle of it. But another thing has to do with the rhythm of this piece. The original rhythm was not this. It was... This was the original version of things. Right? So it was just a melody, and that's how it was meant to be sung in church, was just that melody, but with that rhythm. So it's a different rhythm. A long note, dum, ba, da, da, dum, as opposed to bum, 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 bum. This last note of the phrase was the only long one in the way many people do it now, but some people have definitely learned it with this longer version because, or longer rhythms for some of the notes, because there are arrangements that are set up that way. And so the idea that the same melody can lend itself to different interpretations of it, that's one of the things I'm going to come back to. So interspersed with this, I'm going to show some of the other versions of things and then show off one of my own I just created to honor the occasion of the 100th episode. So I'll show that in a little bit. But what I want to do now is I'm just going to talk through some of the things that we've done in this cafe and just post some links to them so that if people are looking for, I don't know, a tour through things. Let's see, I guess I need to actually go here. So the very first episode was me essentially talking about the same kind of stuff I just talked about, but I went on in great detail about it, about how I got involved with MuseScore and everything having to do with that. So this is my journey. What the hell? Sorry. That's way too long, right? That seems like that's not even the right way to get the link, so I'm going to figure that out better. I think I should hit the share button and get the links that way, except it's slow. All right, so the first episode was just me talking about things. At the time, I wasn't sure. Wow, that's really slow. So one of the things that the people who watch this for a while know is I constantly am complaining about how slow my system gets while I'm broadcasting. So there you go. That's a recurring thread that 2 years later. So that was May 2018. So yeah, just over 2 years ago. 100 episodes, you would think, okay, well, 2 years, I should have gotten a little more than 100 in. But, I took a few weeks off here and there for vacations and whatnot. Anyhow, that's what the first episode was about. But very soon after, I hit on really wanting to focus a little bit on talking about using MuseScore and um, ah, talking about using MuseScore. So giving like little tutorials as part of this. That's been a recurring thing, right, that I do. And there's lots of these scattered throughout. So if you're wanting information on using MuseScore, this one was page layout. And that one I think was a user suggestion. And I definitely have done a lot of those where people have suggested things they would want to see. And oh my gosh, if this is how things are going to be, I'm going to be very disappointed. Because things are just, wow, hanging up big time. So the Fermata playback, did I tweak the inspector for that? That's a good question. Did I didn't do anything having to do with that. I will say that it has changed over the years. And so one of the things, oh, well, here's another thing you can see. This is, during a period of time when I did not have beard, and currently I do. And I'm not saying I'm never going to shave again, but there you go. Things change. So yeah, as far as the Fermata, one of the things that's changed over the years, when I first started with these cafes, MuseScore 2 was the current version. I think we are on 2.2 maybe. And 2.3 came out while we were doing these. And so one of the things I did was show off the new features in 2.3. When we moved from MuseScore 2 to MuseScore 3, a lot of things changed. And I certainly did a big one of the more major probably I think the single most popular cafe that I've ever done, in fact, was on MuseScore 3. And we changed how Fermatas work a little bit because people were struggling. There were a lot of bugs having to do with it, and people were struggling figuring some things out about how to do the playback of Fermatas. So we did change that, going from MuseScore 2 to MuseScore 3. Now, mention was made of the inspector specifically. So, oh yes, so the question I guess was actually about how I did that in the thing. And so yes, by default, it's been decided that Fermatas shouldn't play back anything by default for various reasons, but it's very easy to get them to. You click the Fermata, and then here in the inspector, you set the time stretch however you want. So I set those to a time stretch of 2, meaning it makes that note last twice as long.
My own path to school,
wow.
What brought me here, what I like to do, and give you a little.
Okay, so technical difficulties are no stranger to these cafes, and I just try to soldier on. So yeah, one of the things I want to do is talk about how I've been doing some of the things in doing this, because I'm going to be all over the place with what I do. Talk about some highlights, but also talk about things with this. So yeah, the Fermata playback was just a matter of setting the time stretch here to whatever you want it to be. A time stretch of 4 will make it last 4 times as long as it otherwise would. So now it'll last 4 beats. Right? So that is how you do that. And so actually what I did was I went through, added the Fermatas, then I right-clicked one, said select all similar elements, and that gave me all of them. And then with all of them selected, I can then set them all the same way. And I set them to 2. So that is how I did that. So, and then also, looking at this one, this is something that comes up often for people who are working with liturgical music and other types of music that maybe are not metrical. Like notice this. this is like all one long measure. And it happens that each measure of this is the same length, but that's not always the case. A lot of this kind of music, you just have a bunch of notes on one row and then on one system and then a bunch of notes on the next system, and it could be different notes. So let me show you a little bit about how I do that. What I did was I went and entered the whole notes, bum, and then some half notes, bum, 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 and then whole notes, bum, 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 and that's what I wanted on the first line. So then I select these measures, and I'm going to use Tools, Measure, Join Selected Measures, and boom, now they're all joined together. I don't do that often enough normally to need a shortcut for that, but when I've been putting together a lot of the educational handouts that I've been doing, I have been, like when I was putting scale handouts together especially, I would do that so I could have a scale that was just all quarter notes or all whole notes and not have to worry about how many notes there were in the measure or anything like that, because they weren't all 7-note scales. And so I did customize my own shortcut for that. So for me, I now have it set up where if I select some measures and say Control Alt J, it's on my other computer where I did that. But I saw the shortcut for this in the menu, right? When I went to Tools, Measure, it's Control Shift J on this computer. So on this computer, Control Shift J is what joins things. So customizing shortcuts. If I go to Edit, Preferences, Shortcuts, and then I know it's the join command, so I can type join into the little search box here, and then I see join select measures, and I'm going to change this because I like it the way it is on my other computer, Control Alt J. Control Alt shortcuts are almost never used by MuseScore, so they're all kind of safe and they don't conflict with anything else. And I really should have said, in fact, I'm going to clear that. I'm going to say, I hit the add button. I should have hit replace because really that's what I wanted. Control Alt J, and now I can say add. And then I'm going to do the same for split. Define Control Alt J. What? Control Alt Shift J. Oh, that's crazy talk. Control Alt S is better. Split. There we go. So now I've got these shortcuts set up like they are on my other computer. So those are some features, and you're gonna be seeing little demonstrations of things while I talk here. I'm gonna be, as I said, all over the place as I often am. So I feel like, I was starting to talk about how MuseScore 3 was definitely one of the more popular. In fact, I think the single most popular one. So let me find that one and just make sure I post that link, because the MuseScore 3, when it first came out, was a big deal, because it really added a lot of new capabilities, but changed some things that people were used to, and so there was a lot of confusion about it. And really? Okay, so I used to have ads set up on this, and I think I've turned them off.
This is the wonderful thing about automatic placement. It does its job and continues to do its job.
Okay. Talking about MuseScore development was definitely, has always been a thing that I am doing in these cafes. But another thing that I've been doing is talking about music, talking about actually the process of creating music. And so I've tried to kind of balance this to some extent, talking about using MuseScore and talking about creating music. So like looking over things, one of the very first things that I did was this one, basic compositional advice. That was one of them. But actually, I think one of the maybe more interesting ones, given what I'm talking about today, is going to be this one, 4-part SATB arrangement. And I do actually talk about, using MuseScore, but also the compositional process involved. So I will post that one in there.
I get all the way through it or not, but
what I did on this one was I did a 4-part arrangement of Mary Had a Little Lamb. And like I said, I wasn't sure if I was going to get through the whole thing, but I did it live. I mean, I did not have it all worked out, but if I scroll forward, see if my computer can keep up. Ooh, looks like I'm getting somewhere with it. And I eventually posted the arrangement onto MuseScore.com so people could hear it.
And then
let's go to the end and see if I'm playing the dang thing.
Didn't screw anything up. Let me run that check harmony rules. It's very picky about things. It might find some things.
So I talked about some ways of doing some checks of things. So anyhow,
third here and should really resolve that.
You'll get to hear that if you go check this one out. Yeah, and development, that's the other thing. So thanks for mentioning that. The one of the other things that I've talked about is the actual development process. Things, MuseScore being open source means a lot of things. Among them, it means that anyone can contribute to the development. And so some of the people watching this are people who might be interested in, wow, I might be able to implement some new feature or fix some bugs. And in fact, I'm going to talk about, I got to remind myself. Let me make a little note because I've got some notes about some things. Okay. All right, there we go. So I've done a number of these cafes where I'm talking about kind of the development process. One of them, I I went ahead and said, you know what, I'm going to actually fix a bug live. I knew where the bug was. I had an idea of how to fix it, and then I showed the process. And then, my computer being ridiculously slow meant that I couldn't even finish the compilation. It's not normally slow. It's just broadcasting live the way I'm doing things brings my system down to its knees. I'm not normally working this way. But here you go. This is one where I talk about the development process specifically for someone who might, be interested in development. Actually show what it looks like to be developing MuseScore, show the tools that we're using. Oh, that's a different one. I just clicked the wrong one, so I think I just posted the wrong link. Yeah, I missed by one. So can I edit that comment? I can remove it. That's good enough. So the real link is this one. So those are kind of some of the different things.
Welcome back.
That's part 2.
Things started moving.
No, I want part 1.
Apparently, I just learned.
Here we go. And the reason it was a part 2 is because my system just was so slow. It would not finish compiling, and I wanted to be able to show off that my bug fix worked. So
11th, 2018.
What I did was I hung up, I stopped broadcasting, let the compile finish, and then went back online. And so there was like 2 more minutes of me saying, look, my bug fix worked. Or 8 minutes, I guess, of me saying, look, it worked. So these are some of the things, and I'm always... like you may have noticed sometimes I talk about what I might talk about in the next week or the next couple of weeks, but often I really haven't planned these things very far in advance. And I'm very much interested in you guys' feedback, things you'd want to hear about. So always feel free to be leaving comments in here with suggestions for things you want me to talk about. It can be things I've talked about before, because at some point after 100 episodes, you start to repeat yourself, but hopefully you find new things to say and a new context for them. So that feels like a good transition to talking about my old 100th again. So I'm going to come back to old 100th here, and I mentioned that the way it was designed was it was just this melody to be sung in unison during church services, but and this was a book put together for Calvin, for John Calvin. John Calvin? I think so. and it was for the music of the Calvinist church. But they also published a version of it where things were harmonized so that you would have that option also. And so I don't know if this is the actual original harmonization or not, but I kind of think it probably is. And this is one I found on MuseScore.com. And Louis Bourgeois is the, if I'm pronouncing that at all right, is the person who is probably the composer of this harmonization. He may or may not have written the melody. He more likely worked on the harmonization, but show off your work. Is this yours? Let's see. So this is essentially the same harmonization as we had here. I don't know that it's identical. I haven't looked through it. Well, I can see already the first chord is different. This one is split with the bass note an octave lower, but the other voicings look pretty darn similar. 1, 5, 6, 3, 6. And that's, I think, kind of the same thing that's going on in this version. Yeah, this looks pretty much like the same harmonization. So that was something that happened. But then, so they published both these versions. And this was, I forget the year that this would have been published, but let's say 400 years ago. It became a very popular theme, and originally it went with hymn 136, but eventually it was set to Psalm 136, but eventually it was set to Psalm 100, and that's where the name Hundredth comes from, Old Hundredth. Bach actually created like 2 or 3. Oh, okay. All right. Gotcha. But actually, we did do one Café where I did just let people just, post links. And that was right when coronavirus hit. Ooh, and that's one thing I definitely, as far as greatest hits of the Café go, in my mind, the Corona canon is there. So we did, right when the coronavirus hit, and we were like, what is going on? Things were closed. What's going on? I sort of did a Café where we just shared music. And I played other people's music, and we listened to it, talked about what was going on in our lives. There we go. Okay. Then I put together this Corona Canon project, and many of you were around watching that or involved with creating it, where I basically said, hey, let's take this little recycling chord progression, let's write our own melodies over it, and I'll assemble it into a canon form, much as the way Pachelbel canon was, the Pachelbel canon in D was assembled out of a bunch of melodies that all fit this cycling chord progression. So I just said, hey, let's do our own version of that. And that was a lot of fun. I got like 20-something submissions, and I spent a lot of time gluing them together to form a piece. All right, so let's listen to Bach's harmonization here. So this is a chorale harmonization Bach did.
Welcome to the MuseScore Café.
Let's stop this. Okay. Go back a little further. Bach's harmonization here is, similar in spirit, in that it's basically chorale style, but you'll hear that there's different chords he's using.
Welcome back. As soon as I killed the video, things started moving normally. So apparently, I just learned that even though my system is, more or less usable while I'm streaming
Go away. It went away. Okay. So here's Bach's, one of his harmonizations. So this is one of Bach's harmonizations of that same theme. So for this version, he moved it into another key. And it's really curious to me that he did this, because this is high. I mean, you do not normally write chorales this high. He's got the soprano singing an A up here. I mean, this, well, that's the thing is, I don't know that this was intended to be sung. I believe maybe this was intended just to be an organ arrangement. Although I'm not, no, I don't know that for a fact because this, it did have the lyrics for a different melody set to it. So, Corona Cannon, yeah, got it. Okay, yeah, and that was just a fun project. So I'm glad that people were able to participate. So yeah, Bach's doing a lot of different things here, and you can tell that just by looking at the original and realizing there's not a single accidental in this, right? It's completely diatonic. Well, Bach's version here is starting to introduce things like this. So right in the space of those three measures, we get two different accidentals, and they're not just trivial accidentals, passing tones or whatever. These are really important tones. They're what's called essential chromaticism. It's part of the chord. In both cases, these are secondary dominants. For those of you keeping score at home, this B minor chord here is the 3 chord. This is an F sharp chord, an F sharp major chord. It's the 5 chord in the key of B minor. So it's called, it says that we're tonicizing this B minor. We're pretending we're in the key of B minor for a moment, even though we're not. Here we have E, A, C sharp. That's an A major chord. And here we have an E7 chord, the 5-7 chord in the key of A. So again, it's a tonicization. It's called a secondary dominant. So really, I would say if you look at the chromaticism in Bach's music, I don't have any way of giving you a percentage on it, but I'm going to say 80% of it is probably, and not just Bach. Just go through any classical music of the era through, say, late 1800s. You'll probably come up with about 1800 of all, about 80% of all the essential chromaticism, all the places where there's non-diatonic chords. All the places where there's non-diatonic chords, most of them are functioning as what's called secondary dominants. And this is the sort of thing that I'm going to be talking about in this harmony course that I'm in the process of developing. So, and then, yeah, you get one more over here, same story. It's 5-1 in the key of B minor. There's a couple other curious things he does in this version that are worth mentioning. One of them is the bass crosses above the tenor right here. Why? I think, actually I don't know why, to be honest, but my guess is it's because otherwise if he had kept, he could have switched these two notes. He could have said, hey, let this note be the tenor and that note be the bass. If he did that, he would have had a repeated note in the bass, AA. Not that repeated notes are inherently bad. In vocal music, they're actually fine, especially when all the other notes are moving. One voice staying common is considered really good form. But if it was meant as an organ piece, maybe they're on instrumental music, having to repeat a note is a little different because it means your finger has to come all the way off that key before it comes back down again. Or if you're playing a wind instrument, it means you have to tongue that note versus slur the note. So for instrumental music, there can be a very practical reason to not want to repeat notes unnecessarily. You do it when you want to. And I can see he's doing it some places here, like B, there's a repeated note there. So it's not like he's got repeated notes, A. So I'm probably just making this up. But in any case, it's something I can talk about. One of the things that was accomplished by avoiding the repeated, because the alto, check this out. He wanted to avoid parallel octaves, right? He wanted to avoid the sense that the alto and the bass would have the same note twice in a row, an octave apart and then an octave apart. Usually when we talk about parallel octaves, we mean an A and an A followed by a B and a B or a G and a G, right? A note a step away. But here it was going to be literally A and an A and an A and an A. So he switched the voices around just to avoid repeated octaves. Wow. Okay, there's Bach for you. He's taking care of those sorts of things. Before I put Bach aside, though, got to hear his other harmonization. New key now. We're in the key of B flat. This is, I think, pretty clearly meant to be an organ piece, not a vocal piece, because that bass line is not something that you're going to It's singable, I guess, but it's a lot of so. So that is another harmonization Bach did. He did yet another one too. I don't have it handy, but these two were written at a similar period as part of a similar collection of work music. So I found them together. So this also is like mostly diatonic, but certain places where again he's giving me a secondary dominant into the relative minor, into the sixth chord, and doing it again here. Here he doesn't do the other version. I think basically E natural is what I would have needed here to make this be the same harmonization, because he had he had the 5 chord there. It was A in the key of D and then E, so 5 of 5. So here, if I make this an E natural, I'll have the same harmonization he used in the other one. He just chose not to use the secondary dominant here. Let's see what that sounds like. So that's what it would have been like with the E. And so he didn't choose to do it that way, and that's fine. Bach knows what he's doing and does what he wants to do. One of the really curious things to me when I was listening to this slowly and carefully and thinking, I didn't do a complete analysis of this, but I wanted to see what things he was doing. This chord jumped out at me. Listen to this chord. Want to hear that again? Just that chord. It's dissonant as heck. We have an E flat here and a D there. That interval is a minor ninth, right? It's a half step, D to E flat, plus an octave, actually plus 2 octaves. That is considered the single most dissonant interval. The tritone gets all this attention as, oh, devils, whatever. The tritone has always been a lovely interval that people have loved to use. They just want to resolve it appropriately and use it in its proper context. But the minor ninth has been one that people have really gone out of their way to avoid in a lot of music, and here Bach is slamming us with it. Now, of course, he does resolve it. It's only there for an eighth note, but he puts it pretty prominently, right where that chord changes. It's fairly prominent. So, there's Bach just saying, I can do this. It's going to be okay. Trust me. And that's like a good lesson to all of us to say, just because there's some rule that says don't do something, it doesn't mean you can't do it. The rule doesn't, I often like to say about music theory, it doesn't tell you what to do, it tells you cause and effect. So it tells you that minor ninth causes dissonance. But, if you resolve that dissonance, if you're okay with that little crunch right there, have it, whatever. It doesn't care if you do it. It just tells you, hey, it's going to cause some dissonance. So be prepared for it. So yeah, that's a little bit more about Old 100th, and before we go, I'll show you a little harmonization that I put together. Let me return to my notes here and make sure there's nothing else in particular. Oh yeah, there's a couple other particular things that I should mention about. In fact, I'm just going to put the link to the playlist. That way you all can hunt through yourself. So there's the playlist. Yeah, and again, I want to come back to the Corona canon, and that's, you'd never composed anything before in your life. That's amazing, because every single melody I got was something that felt really good. I mean, some people submitted just one, some people submitted 4, or any number in between there, and I was able to find 1 or 2 from everyone that were just like, yeah, this is gonna sound really nice. And so I'm glad you gave it a shot, and I was happy to be able to use it. So some of the other things that are in here that are worth mentioning, if you want to hunt around, is at some point I decided I wanted to be able to have guests on there. And so now I've been able to do that. I've done it like 4 times now. Over the last month, I did it with all the Google Summer of Code students. But the first one I did was Philip Rothman, different genre there. Philip Rothman, who is a notation software guru. He wrote what was the Sibelius blog, now Scoring Notes blog, and it's just sort of keeps up with what's going on with music notation software. And then he's a professional music engraver himself. And so we just talked about his career, his blog, and then this thing that he developed that allows you to use a device. He didn't create the device, but he created the customizations called Stream Deck, where you can then basically use the Stream Deck as a palette to enter symbols. It's a really cool thing. So let me just put on Philip's thing. It was my first time doing an interview as part of one of these cafes, and I now have multiple ways of doing that. So happy to have that going on. And I know when I go back, it's going to keep talking. So I got to bringing on a. There we go. Okay. So there was that. A couple other things that I want to mention. One that's really important to me personally. You all know that I talk about accessibility periodically, and I've worked with blind music students. And so there was one really special one to me that I did on accessibility, where we had done a whole lot of work on MuseScore to make it more accessible to blind users, right at a time when suddenly I had a blind student in my music theory course that I was teaching. And so I was able to kind of demonstrate MuseScore for her, show her how to use things, and there she is, Elizabeth.
Very, very good for interacting.
So there you go. But realistically, we know that a handful of people watch this particular broadcast live, and then many more watch. So the accessibility one is one. I did several talking about that theme, but this is the one where I actually brought Elizabeth on as guest, and then I did a follow-up also. And that has really been a big part of what I have worked on with MuseScore, has to do with accessibility, because having taught a few blind musicians now and worked with some in other contexts, I realize that there's like a real lack of good tools in this area. Or there's some good ones, but they're really expensive. There's the fact that MuseScore is available for free is great, and a lot of people appreciate that because the other good tools are very expensive. But especially for blind users, you're much more limited in the options. So I was really happy with that, being able to do that. So I guess I forgot to put in what this link was for. Over here. So since I can't edit, there we go. All right. So what I want to talk about, there's all sorts of things. I've talked about education, but I mean, there's just so many things in here that I would like decide, okay, this is going to be a thing that I'm going to do, and therefore I'm going to talk about at these cafes. And that's one of the things I've done. And so dealing with education, the fact that I'm an educator and that I do work involving using MuseScore in an educational context, and then creating new features, really, to make
2018. And the topic that I have chosen to talk about today
and now
is MuseScore in education. And my
that I want to keep hearing that, even though I don't. So that's been another recurring theme, me talking about using MuseScore in an educational context. Okay, so but what I want to kind of shift gears a little bit to talk about now is some of the things that are going on currently and coming up. So there's one big thing going on in the MuseScore world right now, and that's MuseScore 3.5. So you've seen me talk about MuseScore 3.5. I did a cafe when we released an alpha version, and another cafe when we released a beta version. We're getting ready now for the final release. Getting ready, whatever, days, a week, 2, I don't know what it's going to be. But we're getting close. So we'll have a release candidate, meaning we don't plan to make any changes after this. There's no other bugs we expect to fix or anything. We're going to put the release candidate out, and then we're going to beg people to help us test, make sure that we didn't miss anything, and then if no one finds anything terrible, we're going to release that exact same thing and call it the real MuseScore 3.5. More likely, though, something will turn up and we'll fix that, and some little last-minute tweaks will happen between the release candidate and the final release, and then there will be a MuseScore 3.5. I say final release because, no, of course, then once MuseScore 3.5 hits for real, there'll be a 3.5.1 to fix the bugs that inevitably get found once the real 3.5 comes out, because we know a small percentage of users will install alpha or beta versions or even release candidates. Most people will wait for the real thing to come out, and that's when we'll get more bug reports. And there's quite a lot of new stuff, as you've seen if you've watched the Café here. So MuseScore 3.5 is a big part of what we're dealing with right now. One of the big things that I'm dealing with right now, I've mentioned, is this idea of creating online courses around music education. So specifically, I'm creating a harmony course, a course I'm tentatively calling Harmony and Chord Progressions. And the idea is to explain all this stuff I've been talking about here, like secondary dominance and so forth. And in conjunction, so I'm developing that course. I've already put out a basic music theory course, right? And I need to do my obligatory commercial here, basic music theory. I can just type that thing because I know the URL for that and can find it. I can type it faster than I can get the website to load. MasteringMuseScore.com, PE Basic Theory. All right, so yeah, that basic theory course I put out a couple months ago, and it's people are liking it, and like I said, it teaches scales and just how to spell chords and intervals and these basic sorts of things. So that's all well and good, and that was what the course was that I was teaching when I had Elizabeth as a student there. But that's just really get you a starting point for at least having the vocabulary to be able to discuss what makes a chord progression work. So that's the real meat of what I want to talk about in music theory. So this harmony course that I'm in the course of developing, you can check out how it's progressing. I'm opening it for pre-enrollment. I'll put in that URL. But in addition to that, I have what I'm calling a music master class. And this, I just do lessons on a regular basis. Currently, I'm doing something about every week where I'm posting lessons. And the idea with the master class is I want to give people feedback. I want it to be a personal experience. So with the music master class, the idea is, if you have your own compositions or your own recordings you've made, I can actually critique it like in a regular master class, how that works. So yeah, that's one of the things that I'm working on currently. So I've mentioned that one of the things that I'm doing as part of this is teaching some of these again, guidelines for how, if you do this, it's going to sound like that. Secondary dominants, you don't have to use them, but if you do it, it's going to sound like this, and it's going to be pretty cool. Maybe you want to do it, but you don't have to. So I'm teaching about all these things about how chord progressions work, and we often use these 4-part arrangements, like these chorale-style arrangements like this. Now, my experience, as you know, many of you know, my original training was as a classical pianist, just like anyone taking classical piano lessons, but I kept it up through high school. I was never on a trajectory of really being a concert pianist because I was also studying theory and composition, and then also started getting into jazz in high school. And so then most of my professional experience has been on the jazz side. But my background in classical music, I've in my mind, I see a lot. I don't know. I see ways of combining these. I don't make this artificial dividing line between what I see as appropriate in classical music or appropriate in jazz. I just see techniques that can be used. And one of the things that I would say is, so here's my harmonization of the Old Hundredth. This, you can already tell by looking at it, it's way more chromatic, right? You see all these accidentals. Every measure has accidentals. So, well, except the last measure. And I guess the pickup. But every other measure has accidentals in it. And they're not all secondary dominants. You'll hear, if you recognize sounds of things, you'll hear there's borrowed chords, there's minor four chords. There's also what are called, there's some diminished chords in there. And there's augmented sixth chords. There's the different types of chromatic harmony, and it's jammed into this piece pretty densely. It's not like Bach didn't know how to use all those things, but he was much smarter than I am about being what can people actually sing. So this singable version only has a few accidentals here and there. These melody lines, I can sing this thing. I've never even tried to sing. Nope, I'm already off. Oh, I gotta make this leap here? Seriously? Bum. Ba, ah, ah, da, 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 da. Right? I'm sounding my way through this. I am not a great sight singer, but I know how to get the job done. That's one of the things that I want to stress in some of my teaching of, I haven't tried to put together, I'm not going to put a sight singing together, but ear training in general. I want to point out that you don't have to be a good singer to pull this off. You just have to know a thing or two. And so I want to teach that thing or two. So nothing in here is that hard to sing. This was the hardest thing right here, and it's one note. Okay. In my version, there's some hard stuff to sing. There's just no getting around. I tried to sing this little line. I can do it with help, but this is an awkward one to sing. But I don't know. I think you're going to like this one. So I hope you do. There's nothing jazz about it, except this need for chromaticism. That's not a jazz specific thing, but it's a typical thing in jazz that, don't do something diatonic if you can find something not diatonic that sounds better. And so I'm going to cram this thing full of non-diatonic stuff. Now, it's not like Chopin would not have tried this, or Liszt would, late Romantic era composers absolutely would do this also, but they're probably not writing a lot of chorale versions of things. They would do this in, orchestral music or, dense piano music and stuff. And, so maybe no one ever sings this, but anyhow, without further ado, here is my arrangement of Old Hundredth. So there you have it. I am not doing anything in here that Bach wouldn't have done somewhere, or that maybe this chord right here is a non-Bach thing. I don't know about that E sharp. But nothing in here is outside the bounds of what lots of classical composers would do. Most of them would have the sense not to try to cram them all into 8 bars. But that's just, I like hearing that, so by gosh, I'm going to write that. Instrumentally, that's totally playable. I could sit down at the piano right now and play that. But, I have to practice it a moment first. But I could give it to a string quartet to play. If I gave it to a choir to sing, it would take them a while. If they're a really great professional choir, I'm sure they could sight read it, but they would be bitching and moaning about some of this stuff, I'm sure. That is where my mind likes to go. So that's why I don't tend to write a lot of this kind of music for vocalists, because when I do write for vocalists, I immediately realize, what I write, what I want to hear is hard to sing, and therefore I don't write as much of it as I write more instrumental music than vocal music. But I have done, my share of vocal music, and I try to rein in my desire to do stuff like this. But I still do. I still give them hard to sing stuff. So anyhow, the last thing that I want to talk about as far as what's coming, because it's a big thing, is MuseScore 4. It's not coming anytime soon, mind you, but we have announced plans for MuseScore 4, and it's a pretty big deal of what this is going to be. I should have gotten this link. I might have to put it in the comments because it might be... oh, I found it right away. Now that surprised me. Sometimes searches pay off and give you exactly what you want. So there's this wonderful article about plans for MuseScore 4. And when I say plans, I mean like there was just a brainstorming session like a few weeks ago where they kind of sorted out, okay, this is what we think we want to do going forward, and they announced what these plans are. They, meaning like who the core people from Ultimate Guitar who kind of are in charge of direction and stuff. There's still all of us volunteer developers who do what we do, but now there's some paid staff who actually handle a lot of the grunt work of making sure this stuff gets built, of implementing a lot of the stuff that's hard and not fun to implement. So the rest of us can just focus on implementing what we want to implement. MuseScore 4 is really going to focus on the user experience, really making it look nicer in a lot of ways. Some of these are just mock-ups, so some things look nicer than others. But the point is that we're going to really focus on playback aspects. So here's a sequencer that's going to be built into MuseScore to let you do editing of the MIDI, the actual playback data more directly, and other things that have to do with the playback, integrating more with things like this program called Note Performer or other digital audio workstation software, using what's called a VST, virtual synthesizer technology. I don't know what it stands for, but it's a way that you can incorporate more realistic sounding instruments. So MuseScore 4 is going to have a ton of new features having to do with the controlling of playback, but not just playback, but the whole compositional experience. How you use MuseScore as a tool for composing, not just as a way to get dots on a page, because that's a thing also. And we are also very interested in improving what we can about how those dots look on the page. So it's in the new Engraving Forum. So we actually went to just today, created a new entire forum just for discussions of engraving, meaning what the music looks like on the page. So, and there's some discussions that have just been started with proposals and suggestions. And the people who have started these threads, these are like the actual people that MuseScore company, Ultimate Guitar, has hired to work on aspects of the MuseScore design, and in particular to work on, one of them is working specifically on engraving details. So this is a really kind of big deal that we are really taking seriously, both the playback and the engraving, and to a much greater extent than has ever been seen before. So when I say MuseScore 4 is coming, I don't mean next week, I don't mean next month. I probably don't mean this year, but we're all just guessing what's going to happen, but just knowing the scope of what they're talking about, a year out from now, that would feel like, oh, that's not even realistic. It would take longer than that, except the Ultimate Guitar people have proved they're able to get stuff done quickly. So maybe they'll get it done as quick as a year. I don't know. In any case, that's all speculation, but the plans have been announced, they're out there, and so it's going to be really interesting to see what's coming. And so that's going to be stuff that I'm going to be talking about in upcoming cafes as new features are implemented for MuseScore 4. I'm going to want to show off some of them as they look. And so I'm going to show you one of them right now, really the only thing that's been implemented. There's a lot of changes under the hood to make the code easier to maintain and easier to get new developers to deal with, but the inspector looks very different. So if you look at MuseScore 3's inspector, it's this very busy looking thing. Here it is with nothing selected, nothing is in it. select a note and, oh my God, this overwhelming pile of stuff. Well, with MuseScore 4, as it is, and this is not finalized by any means, even with nothing selected, you get some useful things. So you get some of the things that previously you had to go to the view menu for, like you can turn off the display of frames. Look at that. I didn't even know that was in there. That's kind of cool. Oh, I can change between portrait and here. I can change between those. I could change the staff size, except this control doesn't seem to actually be working. So, that's like, we're still very long ways from this working, but it's at least able to show me. Oh, can I type into it? Oh, yeah, I can type into it. That's cool. Oh, and now that I've typed into it, this field is active. Okay, so there you go. It's just a bug. So anyhow, so that there's certain things that you used to have to go to dialogues for that will be done by the inspector. But then even when you select a note, you see that you're not overwhelmed with everything anymore. Some things might be better to have, available right away. So we might end up coming up with a scheme where you can pin things to the inspector maybe, or other ways where maybe it'll just figure out the most used settings and make them more available. But now it's like, oh, I want note settings, and I can click on note settings. And then you can switch between some of the different things. And notice this is all about, appearance. This is the appearance of the notes versus the playback of the notes. The settings are kind of separated out, as opposed to here where it's this huge jumble of things. So that's one of the improvements that you can look forward to. All right, thank you, Julia. There'll just be, hopefully, when all this is all streamlined and this is just very early stage of development, it'll be easier to find the settings you're looking for, because they won't all be hitting you over the head at once and having to hunt through this. You'll know, what I'm looking for has to do with playback, so you hit the playback button, and then there's some only playback settings. You're not having to hunt to find the playback settings buried in the middle of the note setting here. Oh, there's play. Here's velocity. That's a little too... I knew where that was, but my gosh, look how much stuff you have to weed through to find it. The other thing is, there's no rests in this piece, of course, because why would there be? Because, it's too dense for that. But right now, I have a fermata selected and also a note selected. Oh. And suddenly there's nothing in the inspector except the small handful of things. And the same if I had let me go ahead and create a rest. Well, let me do it in another score. I'll select a note and a rest. And you see, you really get very little available. Well, there's a lot of things that apply to both notes and rests. So in MuseScore 4, you will still have the ability to control a lot of settings that apply to notes. Arrange backwards, forwards. What the heck is that? I have no idea what that's about. Well, I get to learn, like everyone else does, what all this stuff is. Bar width. Wow, look at that. Oh yeah, except it's that thing where I have to type into it first before it responds. Funny how I don't know what half these things are because it's all brand new. Ooh, look at that. It's wide now. But yeah, a lot of the things now, if you have multiple things selected, it will let you control anything that's relevant to everything that's selected. Will let you control it, or it'll just give you those controls and apply it to what's relevant. So that's one of the things that's going to be coming. So that's just the inspector. That's just one of the very first things to come, but all this other stuff is going to be coming gradually. So you'll be hearing a lot more about all of this from me in upcoming cafes. Okay, so I feel like I've now said all the things that I want to say. I'm going to go ahead and upload my my 100th, old 100th arrangement to MuseScore.com and put the link in the comment. So, as always, if you have suggestions for future things you want to hear me talk about, by all means, let me hear them. And I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. And I will, thanks for all the support. It's been really fun doing these, and I look forward to the next 100 episodes and hopefully beyond. So, Thanks, everyone, and I will see you all next week. Bye.